French President Emmanuel Macron says he's counting on China to help end the war in Ukraine.
But Beijing's close relationship with Moscow is making things slightly complicated. Yeah. As Macron wraps up his 3-day visit to China's capital, Chinese President Xi Jinping has renewed calls for peace talks. However, Xi noted such negotiations should consider the security concerns of all parties, a comment seen as a nod to Russia.
Let's bring in Reva Goujon now. She is director at the research and consulting firm Rhodium Group. Because, Reva, the key question here is what is China's motivations? This so-called peace plan that was announced between China and Russia, really, it wasn't a peace plan when you talk to a lot of U.S. observers because it didn't lay out how to end the war. So why isn't China motivated to bring that war to an end?
Well, there's a bit of a mismatch that you can see where a lot of European, American policymakers will give the impression that Beijing has the ability to get Russia to end the war. And I think that's a bit overstated. Yeah. Ultimately, this comes down to what does Putin want to do and when. And as we've already seen from Russian spokespersons just around the mediation effort, they're not ready. As your Ukraine update just noted, the battle is continuing here. But China is positioning itself as a mediator. And I think that is important because if you just look at past diplomatic efforts, Minsk I, Minsk II, this is now a forum whenever you get to some sort of negotiation, when the Ukraine battle reaches a stalemate, China will be at that negotiating table for the first time. And it's underscoring its diplomatic credibility in the meantime through these Middle East breakthrough summits. There are limitations there, but it will be playing a role. And China wants to point to that in demonstrating that it's a new world, a multipolar world, and the decline of U.S.-led hegemony. That's the Chinese narrative, of course, that it wants to push. Reality is a little bit different.
So, as you know, this visit was also about strengthening economic ties between France and China. I find it remarkable that you don't hear the same language used against China that you hear in the United States by American lawmakers, which is almost not just adversarial, which China remains, but also almost as if China is an enemy of the United States. But you don't really hear that from our European allies. So what message does that send to the United States vis-a-vis tensions that are increasing with China?
Well, the last thing Europe wants is a two-front confrontation with Russia and China in Eurasia. It's trying to avoid that. It clearly sees the U.S. in the lead in escalating competition with China. So there's an effort to create a counterbalance and use economics as that main channel of engagement. But there is a ton of nuance here where, of course, China would like to keep a large transatlantic divide. But there's actually a lot of convergence that you see between the U.S. and EU on China economic security policy. And the list is long. If you look at Europe's foreign subsidy regulation, the Critical Raw Materials Act, anti-coercion tools, human rights sanctions, forced labor due diligence, even early steps on outbound investment screening, which the U.S. is rolling out. And as European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen also pointed to in a recent speech.
So, Reva, how might Taiwan complicate that then? Because we just saw this week the leader of Taiwan on an unofficial visit stopover through the states, they call it, because they didn't want to annoy China, as she was strengthening ties with both Democrats and Republicans. But what would happen if China were to invade Taiwan? How would Europe respond to that, considering what you've just laid out?
It's a very important question, and one that is also a work in progress, where the U.S. is trying to get its G7 partners on the same page of what the coordinated, concrete response would be 2 steps along that escalation ladder over Taiwan, below also that threshold of hot conflict. And that's where the focus does need to be, because you can already see Beijing laying the groundwork for what's called a peaceful quarantine scenario. Security patrols were out, and there's now a question of whether Chinese authorities would board ships that are coming into Taiwan? Would it try to assert its territorial claims to Taiwan through these more subtle tactics? Where then the question goes back to the U.S. and its partners. Does it need to escort ships? Does it need to reflag them? We're back to tanker crisis questions now. This is very, very quickly escalating. And any display of Russia-China military cooperation only helps steer that conversation, as does any significant signs of military coercion from China toward Taiwan.
Wow. Well, this is The World Today. Great global news chat with you, Reva Goujon, joining us there from Austin, Texas.